The kerosene lamp flickered as Margaret Bennet stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Her wedding dress, bought secondhand from a shop in Boston, hung loose on her thin frame. 3 months of travel had brought her to this remote Montana settlement, where she would marry a man she had never met. Thomas Whitmore's letters had promised a comfortable home, respect, and a fresh start. The reality waiting downstairs told a different story. She could hear him below, his heavy boots crossing the wooden floor. The smell of whiskey drifted up through the floorboards. During the brief ceremony at the trading post, she had seen the cruelty in his eyes. The postmaster who performed the marriage had rushed through the words, avoiding her gaze. The 2 witnesses, rough men who worked Whitmore's land, had smirked throughout. No one had offered congratulations. Margaret pressed her palm against the cool glass. At 23, she had exhausted her options in Boston. Her parents were dead. The factory where she sewed shirts had closed. Her landlady had given her 1 week to produce rent money she did not have. The advertisement in the newspaper had seemed like providence. Widow or spinster wanted for marriage to established rancher. Must be of good character and strong constitution. She had written immediately, her letter careful and honest. She mentioned her needlework skills, her ability to read and cipher, her experience keeping house for her invalid mother. She had not mentioned the bruise her former employer had left on her wrist when she rejected his advances. She had not mentioned the desperate hunger that made her hands shake as she wrote. Whitmore's response had arrived within 2 weeks. He sent money for passage west and detailed instructions. His handwriting was neat, his words formal. She had allowed herself to hope. The boots stopped at the base of the stairs. Margaret. His voice was thick with drink. Get down here. Now. Her hands moved to the buttons at her collar. She had fastened them to her throat before the ceremony, a small gesture of modesty. Now she understood it had been futile. Thomas Whitmore was not a man who respected boundaries. She had seen how he grabbed the arm of the woman who served them dinner at the trading post. She had heard the threat hidden beneath his words when he told her she belonged to him now. The door rattled. I said now. Margaret looked around the bare room. A rope bed with a stained mattress. A wooden chair with 1 leg shorter than the others. A window that overlooked the dark prairie. The glass was dirty, but through it she could see the vast emptiness beyond the settlement. No neighbors. No help. No escape. Her wedding ring felt heavy on her finger. The band was too large, sliding loose when she moved her hand. In the lamplight, she could see it was tarnished brass, not gold as he had promised in his letters. Like everything else about Thomas Whitmore, it was a lie. Margaret. The door shook in its frame. Wood splintered near the lock. She made her decision in an instant. Her hands flew to the buttons of the wedding dress, fingers clumsy with fear. She stripped it off and pulled on the traveling clothes she had worn west. The sturdy wool skirt, the plain blouse, the worn boots. She grabbed her small bag, which held everything she owned. A change of clothes. Her mother's Bible. The silver hairbrush that had belonged to her grandmother. The door burst open as she threw her leg over the windowsill. Thomas Whitmore's face was red with rage, his eyes wild. He lunged forward, fingers grasping. Margaret dropped into the darkness. She hit the ground hard, pain shooting through her ankle. But she was young and fear made her strong. She ran into the night, away from the settlement, away from the man who thought he owned her. Behind her, she heard him shouting. Then came the sound she had dreaded. The crack of a rifle shot split the air. She did not look back. The Montana prairie stretched endlessly under the moon. Margaret ran until her lungs burned and her injured ankle screamed with each step. Behind her, lantern lights bobbed in the darkness. Men's voices carried on the wind. Whitmore had gathered a search party. She was property now, legally his wife, and the law would return her to him if they caught her. She stumbled into a dry creek bed and pressed herself against the earthen wall. Blood from her scraped palms stained her skirt. Her breath came in ragged gasps that she struggled to quiet. The voices grew closer. She recognized Whitmore's angry shouts mixed with the drawling tones of his ranch hands. They were spreading out, covering more ground. Can't have gone far, one man called. Woman alone out here won't last the night anyway. When we find her, she'll wish she hadn't run. Whitmore's voice was cold with fury. I'll teach her what happens to disobedient wives. Margaret bit her lip to keep from whimpering. She knew what he meant. She had seen the bruises on the arms of women in the settlement. She had heard the careful silence that fell when certain husbands entered a room. The frontier was a hard place, and the law rarely protected women from their own husbands. The lantern lights passed north of her position. She waited until the voices faded, then climbed from the creek bed and continued west. Her ankle throbbed but she ignored it. Pain was nothing compared to what awaited her if they dragged her back. The landscape changed as she walked. Rolling grassland gave way to rougher country. Hills rose against the starlit sky. She had no plan beyond escape, no knowledge of where she was going. The September night was growing cold. Her thin jacket provided little warmth against the prairie wind. Dawn found her collapsed beside a stand of cottonwood trees. She had walked for hours, putting miles between herself and the settlement. Her water was gone. Her ankle had swollen to twice its normal size. Exhaustion pulled at her consciousness. She knew she should keep moving, but her body refused to obey. The sun rose higher, bringing heat that made her head swim. Thirst became her only thought. She forced herself to stand and limped forward, searching for water. The landscape blurred. She fell twice before she heard it. The sound of running water somewhere ahead. The stream was narrow but clear, flowing over smooth rocks. Margaret fell to her knees and drank deeply, not caring about propriety or caution. The cold water revived her enough to notice her surroundings. She was in a small valley between hills. Scattered trees provided shade. It seemed as good a place as any to rest. She woke to find herself surrounded by horses. Not the heavy draft animals she knew from Boston, but sleek ponies with painted marks on their flanks. Her heart hammered as she scrambled backward. Then she saw the riders. There were 5 of them, all men, all watching her with expressions she could not read. They wore buckskin and feathers, their long hair decorated with beads. Their faces were painted with red and black designs. She had never seen Indians before, had only heard the frightening stories told by other passengers on her journey west. One rider dismounted. He was tall and moved with the grace of a predator. His face was strong, his eyes dark and intelligent. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her torn clothes, her swollen ankle, the desperation written across her features. Then he spoke, his English clear but accented. "You run from something." It was not a question. Margaret tried to speak but her throat was too dry. She managed a small nod. The man turned to his companions and spoke in a language she did not understand. They responded, their tones questioning. A debate seemed to be happening. Finally, the tall man looked back at her. "You are in Lakota territory. White settlers are not welcome here." He paused. "But you do not look like a settler. You look like prey." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. She had survived the night only to face a new danger. But something in the man's eyes made her find her voice. "Please," she whispered. "Don't send me back. I would rather die out here than go back to him." The man studied her for another long moment. Then he held out his hand. The Lakota camp appeared as they crested a hill. Dozens of teepees spread across a meadow beside a winding river. Smoke rose from cook fires. Children played near the water while women worked on hides stretched across wooden frames. Dogs barked as the riders approached. The scene looked peaceful, almost pastoral, nothing like the savage camps described in the penny dreadfuls Margaret had read back east. The tall man had introduced himself as Taka Hust, which he translated as lame deer. The name seemed ill-fitting for someone who moved with such fluid grace. He had lifted her onto his horse without effort, and she had spent the hours-long ride trying not to lean against him, though exhaustion made her head droop repeatedly against his shoulder. They stopped before the largest teepee. An older man emerged, his face weathered and wise. Silver streaked his long braids. He wore a shirt decorated with intricate quill work and a necklace of bear claws. His authority was evident in the way others deferred to him. Taka Hust dismounted and spoke at length in Lakota, gesturing occasionally toward Margaret. The older man's eyes settled on her. His gaze was penetrating but not unkind. He asked a question. Taka Hust answered. The older man nodded slowly, then spoke a single word that seemed to be a command. "My father says you may stay," Taka Hust told her. "But you must tell us your story. All of it. We do not help enemies of our people." 2 women approached and helped Margaret from the horse. They supported her weight as they led her to a smaller teepee and gestured for her to sit on buffalo robes spread across the ground. One woman, young and pretty with kind eyes, brought her water in a beautifully decorated container. The other, older and stern-faced, began examining her swollen ankle with practiced hands. Margaret drank gratefully, then began to speak. She told them about Boston, about the death of her parents, about the factory closing and the desperation that had driven her west. She described Thomas Whitmore's letters, the lies they contained, the trap she had walked into willingly. Her voice broke as she described her wedding night, the smell of whiskey, the violence in his eyes. She showed them the bruises forming on her arms where he had grabbed her before she jumped from the window. Taka Hughes translated her words. The women listened intently. The older one made a disgusted sound and spoke sharply. Taka Hughes' expression darkened. Winona says such men exist among all peoples. She has seen soldiers treat their wives this way at the fort. She says you were right to run. The young woman spoke softly, her tone questioning. Taka Hughes nodded and turned back to Margaret. Zitkala asks if this man will follow you here. Will he bring other white men to our camp seeking his wife? Margaret's blood turned cold. She had not considered this danger. Would Whitmore guess where she had gone? Would he bring men with guns to demand her return? She could be putting these people in danger simply by being here. I don't know, she admitted. He was very angry. But I don't think he knows about your camp. I walked west through the night. I had no idea where I was going. Taka Hughes spoke with the women again. Then he stood. Rest now. Tonight there will be a council. The elders will decide what to do with you. He left the teepee. Margaret sat alone with the two women, who spoke to each other in low voices while the older one prepared a poultice for her ankle. The mixture smelled of herbs and earth. Winona applied it with surprising gentleness, then wrapped the ankle with soft leather strips. Zitkala brought food. Roasted meat, some kind of root vegetable, and bread that tasted of corn and was unlike anything Margaret had eaten before. She was hungrier than she realized and ate quickly. The women watched with approval. As evening fell, drums began to beat. Margaret heard voices rising in song. Through the teepee opening, she saw people gathering around a large central fire. Taka Hughes returned and gestured for her to follow. She limped after him, her wrapped ankle providing more support than she expected. The council circle consisted of perhaps 20 people, mostly older men but also several women whose bearing suggested they held significant authority. Taka Hughes' father, who she learned was called Chief Tatanka Ohitika, sat at the center. He gestured for Margaret to approach. She stood before them, her heart pounding. These people held her fate in their hands. They could send her back to Whitmore. They could kill her. They could do nothing and let the prairie claim her. She straightened her spine and met the chief's eyes, determined to face whatever judgment came with dignity. Chief Tatanka Ohitika spoke at length. His voice was deep and resonant. Though Margaret understood nothing, she heard wisdom in his tone. Taka Hughes translated his father's words. My father says the Lakota people know about running from enemies. We know what it means to have everything taken from you. Our lands grow smaller each year as white settlers push west. The government makes treaties and breaks them. They promise us this valley, then they find gold and want it back. We understand what it means to have nowhere safe to go. Chief Tatanka Ohitika continued speaking. Around the circle, people nodded or murmured agreement. An elderly woman with deeply lined features raised her hand and spoke passionately. Her words brought sounds of approval from others. That is Grandmother Wanbley, Taka Hughes explained. She says women everywhere suffer under cruel men. She says the spirit sent you to us for a reason. She believes we should grant you sanctuary. But not everyone agreed. A younger warrior with a scarred face stood and spoke forcefully, his tone challenging. He pointed at Margaret repeatedly. Other voices rose in support of his position. The debate grew heated. Red Cloud says you bring danger, Taka Hughes told her quietly. He says white men will come looking for you. They will use your presence as an excuse to attack us. They always look for excuses. He says we should return you to the settlement before sunrise. Margaret's throat tightened. She understood his concern. These people had enough troubles without adding her problems to their burdens. She started to speak, to tell them she would leave willingly rather than endanger them, but Taka Hughes held up his hand. Wait. My father is not finished. Chief Tatanka Ohitika stood. Silence fell immediately. He spoke with quiet authority, his words measured and deliberate. He gestured to Margaret, to his son, to the people gathered around the fire. His speech went on for several minutes. When he finished, the entire council seemed to hold its breath. My father says Red Cloud speaks wisdom about the danger. But he also says we cannot abandon someone who seeks shelter. To turn away someone in need would make us no better than those who steal our land. However, there is a solution. Taka Hughes paused, his expression unreadable. According to our laws, if you were to join our tribe through marriage, you would become Lakota. You would no longer be the property of your white husband. The tribe would be honor-bound to protect you. Margaret's mind reeled. Marriage. She had fled one husband only to be offered another. But as she looked around the circle, she saw this was different. These people were debating her fate openly. They were considering her welfare. No one looked at her with Whitmore's predatory hunger. Who would I marry? Her voice came out as barely a whisper. Taka Hughes met her eyes steadily. Me. As the chief's son, my marriage would carry weight. It would make your position in the tribe unquestionable. But you must understand what you would be accepting. You would live as Lakota. Learn our language, our ways. You would give up your life among the whites forever. There would be no going back. And if I refuse? Then at dawn we will give you a horse and supplies. You can try to find another white settlement far from here. But winter comes soon. Alone on the prairie, you will not survive. Margaret looked at this man who had found her by the stream. He had shown her nothing but respect. He had not touched her except to help her onto his horse. He had translated honestly, even when the words were harsh. She thought about Thomas Whitmore, about the terror she had felt in that upstairs room. She thought about the alternative Taka Hughes offered. A life among people who seemed to care for each other. A chance to belong somewhere. If I agreed, would you expect? She could not finish the sentence, but he understood. I would expect nothing you do not freely offer. This would be a marriage of protection, not possession. When and if you wished for more, you could tell me. Until then, you would be safe. You have my word. Around the circle, people waited for her answer. Margaret realized that several hours ago she had been prepared to die rather than return to Whitmore. This man offered her not just survival but the possibility of a real life. She would be a fool to refuse. Yes, she said clearly. I accept. Grandmother Wandley smiled and spoke words that sounded like a blessing. Other women began to ululate, a high-pitched sound that startled Margaret but seemed celebratory. Chief Tatanka Ohitika nodded his approval. Even Red Cloud, though he still looked skeptical, inclined his head in acknowledgement. The ceremony happened immediately. There was no time for preparation or second thoughts. Taka Hughes and Margaret stood before the fire while the chief spoke words in Lakota. Women brought forward a buffalo robe and wrapped it around both of them, binding them together. People came forward with gifts. A knife in a beaded sheath. A dress of soft doeskin decorated with shells. A pair of moccasins lined with rabbit fur. When it was done, Taka Hughes led her to his teepee. Inside, the space was surprisingly comfortable. Buffalo robes covered the ground. A fire pit in the center provided warmth and light. Weapons hung on one side, carefully maintained and beautiful in their deadliness. Margaret woke to the sound of women's laughter outside the teepee. Morning light filtered through the hide walls, creating a warm glow. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then memory returned. She was married again. She was Lakota now. Taka Hughes' sleeping robes on the opposite side of the teepee were already folded neatly. True to his word, he had respected her space completely. They had talked late into the night, his English improving as he relaxed. He told her about his people, about the traditions she would need to learn. She told him more about her life in Boston, about the books she loved to read, the dreams she once had of teaching school. Zitkala pushed aside the teepee flap and entered with an armful of clothes. She smiled broadly and gestured for Margaret to stand. With patient hands, she helped Margaret out of her torn traveling clothes and into the doeskin dress. It was softer than anything Margaret had ever worn, decorated with intricate beadwork that must have taken weeks to create. The moccasins fit perfectly, warm and flexible. Winona arrived with a comb made of bone. She began working through Margaret's tangled brown hair, speaking constantly in Lakota. Though Margaret understood nothing, the tone was unmistakably instructive. She was being taught, welcomed, initiated into the daily rhythms of camp life. Outside, the camp was fully awake. Women tended fires and prepared food. Men checked weapons and horses. Children ran everywhere, playing games that involved much shouting and laughter. Several people stopped to stare at Margaret, but their curiosity seemed friendly rather than hostile. Taka Hughes appeared at her side. In daylight, she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 30, his face marked by a thin scar along one cheekbone. His eyes were intelligent and kind. He wore his authority lightly, greeting everyone they passed with easy familiarity. Come, he said. I will teach you useful words. The first word every person should know is Wakan. It means sacred or mysterious. The world is full of Wakan things, if you have eyes to see them. They walked along the river while he pointed to objects and spoke their Lakota names. Water. Tree. Sky. Bird. Horse. Margaret repeated each word, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. He corrected her pronunciation with patience, never showing frustration when she had to hear a word 5 times before getting it right. Days passed in a blur of learning. Zitkala taught her how to prepare food, how to tan hides, how to maintain the teepee. She learned which plants were edible and which were poisonous. She learned how to move quietly through the prairie grass, how to read weather signs in the clouds, how to start a fire with flint and steel. The other women accepted her with surprising warmth. They laughed at her mistakes but never cruelly. When she accidentally burned the stew she was making, they simply showed her again how to monitor the fire's heat. When she struggled to carry water from the river, they demonstrated how to balance the containers on her shoulders. Takahust remained true to his promise. He treated her with respect and patience. They talked for hours each evening, her English and his Lakota mixing as they worked to understand each other. He told her about his mother, who had died of the white man's smallpox 5 years earlier. She told him about losing her parents, about the loneliness that had driven her to answer Whitmore's advertisement. "You were brave to travel so far alone," he said one night. "Many warriors would hesitate to make such a journey." "I wasn't brave. I was desperate. Sometimes they are the same thing." 3 weeks after her arrival, scouts brought news. White men from the settlement were searching the region. They were looking for a runaway bride. They were asking questions at other camps, offering a reward for information. Thomas Whitmore was determined to find his property. Margaret's blood turned cold. But Takahust simply nodded and spoke with his father. That evening, the entire camp prepared to move. Within hours, the teepees were taken down, belongings packed, horses loaded. They traveled north into rougher country, following paths that only the Lakota knew. "He cannot follow where we go," Takahust assured her. "These are our lands. We know every stream and valley. He is like a man stumbling in the dark while we walk in daylight." They made camp in a hidden canyon where a waterfall fed a clear pool. It was more beautiful than any place Margaret had seen. That night, as she helped Zitkala set up their teepee, she realized something had changed. She was no longer afraid. She was no longer the desperate woman who had jumped from a window to escape. She was learning. She was growing stronger. She was becoming someone new. Takahust found her sitting by the water as stars emerged. He settled beside her, maintaining the respectful distance he always kept. "Do you regret your choice?" he asked quietly. Margaret thought about the question seriously. She had given up everything familiar. She would never see Boston again. She would never wear the clothes of her old life or speak her native language exclusively. But she looked around at the camp, at the people who had welcomed her. She thought about Zitkala's patient teaching, Winona's gruff acceptance, Grandmother Wandley's knowing smiles. She thought about this man beside her who had offered protection without demanding payment. "No," she said firmly. "I don't regret it. I think maybe I was always supposed to end up here. Maybe everything that happened was leading me to this place." "Wakan," he said softly. "Mysterious. The spirits work in ways we cannot always understand." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars reflect in the dark water. Somewhere far away, Thomas Whitmore was searching for a woman who no longer existed. The frightened mail-order bride who had fled into the night had transformed into something else entirely. She had become Margaret of the Lakota, a woman who belonged to no man but herself, a woman who had finally found her home.